At 6:01 a.m. on the morning of the shooting, a separate 911 call was placed from a house less than 2 miles away. The caller did not speak clearly. Dispatch records indicate only fragmented audio. Breathing, movement, and then a faint voice. "He shot me." That caller was identified as Lillian Cross, Adrian's former partner. Responding officers would later confirm that she had been shot multiple times, but remained conscious long enough to initiate the call using her phone's voice assistant. According to investigators, Adrian had gone to her home first. A reconstructed account, based on forensic evidence and Lillian's later statement, suggests the encounter lasted less than 2 minutes. When Adrian entered the bedroom, Lillian reportedly sat up abruptly. "What are you doing here?" she asked. There was no sign of forced entry. This indicated that Adrian either still had access or she had not expected him to be a threat. "You left," he told her. Witnesses would later describe his tone as calm, almost detached. "I had to," Lillian responded. "You were scaring us." The first shot struck her before she could say anything further. Despite her injuries, she managed to reach for her phone. That action would ultimately save her life. From there, Adrian returned to the house on Redwood Court. The timeline between locations remains under investigation, but analysts estimate the gap was less than 10 minutes. By the time he arrived, the house was still quiet. Inside were 8 children, ranging in age from 3 to 11. 7 were his. 1 was a visiting relative. Most were asleep. What followed is reconstructed primarily through ballistic evidence and scene analysis. Investigators determined that Adrian moved room to room in a deliberate pattern. There were no signs of struggle in most areas. This suggests that many of the victims were not awake at the time of the shootings. The majority of injuries were concentrated to the head. This level of precision led investigators to conclude that the act was intentional and controlled. Not impulsive, not chaotic, but planned. 2 adult survivors were present in the home at the time. Marissa Cole and her sister, Danielle Price. Both sustained gunshot wounds but managed to escape. According to their statements, they fled through a second-floor exit, dropping onto a lower structure before reaching the ground. Emergency responders later described their survival as extremely unlikely, given the circumstances. By 6:12 a.m., the first police units had arrived on scene. Officer Daniel Reeves was among them. In his initial report, he described entering the residence and immediately recognizing the scale of the incident. "I knew right away this wasn't a single victim situation," he wrote. "There was no movement, no sound, just stillness." He exited the home and called for additional units. "Multiple casualties," he reported. "We need immediate support." At approximately the same time, Adrian was leaving the area. Traffic cameras later captured his vehicle moving eastbound at a consistent speed. There was no attempt to flee at high velocity. No erratic driving. He appeared composed. At 6:25 a.m., law enforcement located the vehicle and initiated a stop. According to radio transcripts, Adrian complied initially. He pulled over, exited the vehicle, and stood facing responding officers. "Drop the weapon," an officer commanded. Adrian did not immediately respond. Body camera footage shows him looking upward briefly, then back toward the officers. For several seconds, there was no movement. Then, the exact sequence of events that followed remains under official review. Authorities have not publicly confirmed whether Adrian was shot by officers or died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. In the days following the incident, Investigators began reconstructing not just the timeline of that morning, but the broader context leading up to it. What they found was not a lack of warning signs, but a pattern of signal that existed in isolation. Each one significant, none of them connected. Former coworkers described Adrian as increasingly withdrawn over the past year. He stopped talking during breaks, one colleague recalled, just sat there staring. Another mentioned a visible patch of hair loss. He used to pull at it when he was stressed, they said. We thought it was just anxiety. Family members reported similar concerns. He wasn't the same, his mother stated in a recorded interview. But every time we tried to talk, he shut down. Financial pressure also appeared to be a factor. Court filings indicate ongoing disputes related to child support, housing costs, and shared responsibilities between two households. The divorce filing, submitted by Marissa just weeks before the incident, marked a turning point. According to those close to the situation, Adrian perceived it not just as separation, but as loss of control. Experts in domestic violence risk assessment note that this period, immediately following or preceding separation, is among the most dangerous, particularly when combined with prior threats. In this case, that combination was present, but never formally documented. As the investigation continued, attention turned to how Adrian obtained the firearms used in the attack. Federal authorities later charged a separate individual, identified as a convicted felon, with illegal possession and transfer of a weapon connected to the case. The full chain of acquisition remains under investigation. By the end of the first week, the scale of the tragedy had begun to settle over the community. 8 children, multiple households, one morning. And yet, as more details emerged, a difficult question began to take shape. Not just how it happened, but whether it could have been prevented. If you've followed this story this far, take a moment to consider that question carefully. Because what comes next isn't just about what Adrian Cole did. It's about everything that led up to it, and the points where the outcome might have changed. If you're watching on YouTube, this is a good place to pause, subscribe, and share your thoughts, because the second half of this story goes deeper into the decisions, the missed signals, and the final moments that still don't have clear answers. In the days that followed, the narrative around Adrian Cole began to shift. At first, it was simple. A man had committed an unthinkable act. But as investigators, journalists, and analysts moved deeper into the details, that simplicity gave way to something more complicated and far more unsettling. Because the more they uncovered, the harder it became to argue that this had come out of nowhere. Phone records showed that Adrian had made 3 calls the night before the shootings. The first went unanswered. The second lasted less than a minute. The third connected. "Mom," he said, on the other end. His mother, Denise Cole, later described his voice as calm, almost too calm. "You don't sound right," she told him. "I'm fine," Adrian replied. There was a pause. "You ever feel like everything's already decided?" he asked. Denise hesitated. "What do you mean?" "Like no matter what you do, it ends the same way." "Adrian talked to me," she said, her voice tightening. "Where are you right now?" "It doesn't matter," he answered. That would be the last conversation they had. Investigators would later mark that call as a critical moment. Not because it directly revealed intent, but because of what it suggested: finality. A mindset that had already moved past decision and into execution. By the time the sun rose fully over Redwood Court, the scene had been secured. Crime scene units moved methodically through the house, documenting every detail. Shell casings, entry points, positions. each piece contributing to a reconstruction that would take days to complete. One investigator later described the process in a closed briefing. There was no sign of hesitation, he said, no indication that he changed his mind at any point. That conclusion aligned with what behavioral analysts would later determine. This was not an escalation in the moment. It was an outcome that had been building. At the hospital, Lillian Cross remained in critical condition. Doctors worked through the morning to stabilize her. When she regained consciousness briefly, an officer was present to take a statement. "Can you tell me what happened?" he asked. Lillian's voice was weak. "He came into the room," she said. I thought maybe he just wanted to talk." She paused, struggling to breathe. "What did he say?" the officer asked. "He said I left him," she whispered, like that was the only thing that mattered. Her account would later become one of the few direct insights into Adrian's state of mind during the attacks. Not rage, not panic, but fixation. Back at the primary residence, Marissa Cole and her sister Danielle Price were being treated for their injuries. Both had survived, but their statements painted a consistent picture. "He wasn't yelling," Danielle said. "That's what I can't get out of my head. He was just doing it." Marissa added very little at first. When she did speak, it was only to repeat one sentence. "I knew he meant it." Investigators asked her to clarify. "The things he said before," she explained, "I knew he meant them." That statement brought renewed attention to the threat Adrian had made months earlier. A threat that, by all accounts, had been taken seriously within the family, but never beyond it. Experts reviewing the case later emphasized how common that pattern is. Threats are often recognized as dangerous by those who hear them. But without formal reporting, they remain outside the systems designed to respond. In this case, that gap proved critical. As the investigation expanded, attention turned again to Adrian's time in the veterans' medical system. Records confirmed his admission following a suicide attempt earlier in the year. They also confirmed his disclosure of intermittent thoughts about harming others. What remained unclear was how those disclosures had been assessed. A senior official familiar with the review process, speaking on background, noted that such cases typically rely on a combination of self-reporting and observable behavior. If a patient minimizes access to weapons, and there's no immediate evidence to the contrary, that can influence the level of intervention, the official said. In Adrian's case, his statement that he did not have access to firearms was accepted at face value. There was no cross-check against his prior conviction. No verification. No escalation. That detail would later become one of the central points of scrutiny, because it illustrated a broader issue, not just what Adrian said, but what the system failed to connect. Meanwhile, federal investigators continued to trace the origin of the weapons used in the attack. Within days, they identified a connection to a known associate with a prior felony record. That individual, later charged with illegal possession and transfer of a firearm, had no legal authority to own or distribute weapons. The transfer itself was unlawful. But beyond the violation, it raised a deeper concern: how easily prohibited individuals could still gain access. Community response in Redwood Court and the surrounding areas grew rapidly. Vigils were organized. Memorials appeared. Local leaders spoke about grief, support, and resilience. But beneath those messages, there was a current of frustration. Not just at what had happened, but at what had not been done to prevent it. One resident, speaking at a community meeting, put it plainly: if all those warning signs were there, why didn't anything stop him? It was a question without a simple answer, because the responsibility did not rest in one place. It was distributed, fragmented, shared across multiple systems that never fully intersected. Legal analysts reviewing the case outlined 4 primary breakdowns. The first was the lack of enforcement around Adrian's firearm prohibition. The second was the absence of a formal response to the documented threat within the family. The third was the limited scope of the mental health intervention. And the fourth was the absence of real-time information sharing between agencies. Each of these, on its own, represented a vulnerability. Together, they formed a pathway. Behavioral experts also highlighted a pattern consistent with what is sometimes referred to as family annihilation. In such cases, the perpetrator often views the family as an extension of identity. When that identity is threatened through separation, loss of control, or perceived rejection, the response can become catastrophic. In Adrian's case, the impending court hearing appeared to act as a trigger point, not because it created the risk, but because it finalized it. By the end of the second week, preliminary findings began to solidify. The timeline was clear. The sequence of events was largely established, but one aspect remained unresolved: the final moments on the roadside. Body camera footage reviewed internally showed Adrian standing outside his vehicle, weapon in hand. Officers issued multiple commands. "Drop it. Put the weapon down." For several seconds, Adrian did not comply. Then, according to initial reports, there was a sudden movement. What that movement was, whether it was raising the weapon or lowering it, remains a point of review. Shots were fired. Adrian fell. A weapon was recovered at the scene. The official determination of cause of death is still pending. For investigators, however, the focus had already shifted. Because regardless of how it ended, the critical question remained unchanged: how it began. In the weeks that followed, internal reviews were launched across multiple agencies. The Veterans Medical System initiated an evaluation of its discharge procedures. Law enforcement agencies examined protocols related to firearm prohibition enforcement. Judicial bodies reviewed processes for identifying high-risk individuals in domestic cases. Each review operated independently. Each focused on a specific piece. But the broader issue, the lack of integration, remained at the center of all of them. For Marissa Cole, recovery would take longer than any investigation. In a brief statement released through her attorney, she addressed the loss directly. "They were everything," she said. "Every single day they were everything." She did not speak about Adrian. Not publicly. Lillian Cross, after multiple surgeries, would eventually regain enough strength to speak more fully about what happened. In one recorded interview, she reflected on the moment he entered the room. "I didn't think he would do it," she said. "Even after everything, I didn't think it would go that far." That statement, more than any analysis, captured the core contradiction of the case. The warning signs were present, but belief in the outcome was not. And that gap, between recognizing risk and believing in consequence, is where many similar cases exist. It is where threats are minimized, where behavior is rationalized, where intervention is delayed, until it is no longer possible. As the story of Redwood Court continues to circulate, it raises difficult questions about responsibility, about prevention, about what systems are designed to do and what they actually achieve. But perhaps the most important question is also the simplest. What would it take for those warning signs to be treated not as possibilities, but as probabilities? Because in this case, the indicators were not subtle. They were clear, they were repeated, and they were unconnected. If you've stayed with this story to the end, then you've seen how it unfolds, not just in moments but in missed opportunities. This isn't just about one individual or one event. It's about the spaces in between, the gaps where information exists, but action doesn't follow. If you found this breakdown insightful, take a moment to like the video, subscribe for more in-depth true crime analysis, and share your perspective in the comments. Do you think this could have been prevented? Or do cases like this reveal limits we still don't fully understand? The answers aren't simple, but the pattern is. And until that pattern changes, stories like this will continue to repeat.